Good morning, and a very warm welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP. Welcome to this week's edition of our weekly morning briefings on geopolitical challenges, every Thursday here live on Zoom at 8:30 a.m. and available on YouTube afterwards. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm the head of the Director's Office here at DGAP, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing this morning's session. Today, we will be talking about the European Economic Security Strategy, which was presented by the European Commission on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, the 20th of June. Now, we have seen a whole range of strategies being published in Germany over the past months, including the long-awaited National Security Strategy last week, and which we covered in our morning briefing last week. Some have come to call it a spring of strategies. Now, with spring coming to an end and summer having officially started yesterday, we are given a European strategy, a strategy on economic security, or as High Representative Vice President Josep Borrell put it, security through economics. Now, what does this actually mean? How is it going to work? Is it going to change anything? And where are the problems and loopholes in this strategy? To discuss these questions, I'm very happy to welcome three excellent and distinguished speakers who are with us today. First up is Francesca Ghiretti, an analyst at MERICS, the Mercator Institute for China Studies. Francesca, you are based in Brussels and are focusing on EU-China relations. Welcome to you. Next is...
Thank you, Jan.
Next will be our own Tim Rühlig, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the DGAP's Center for Geopolitics, Geoeconomics and Technology. Tim is an expert on China's technological standardization power, 5G, and a range of other aspects of Chinese tech foreign policy and foreign policy more broadly. Glad to have you, Tim. And finally, Guntram Wolff, who's Director and CEO of DGAP, formerly head of the Brussels-based think tank Bruegel. Guntram, an economist, specializes on various aspects of geoeconomics, and he has also recently published a policy paper called China De-risking, which my colleagues will be sharing in the chat with you. And full disclosure, Guntram is also my boss, but I will be no less hard on him asking questions as we proceed. Before we begin, hi, Guntram. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind you that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded afterwards. We will first kick things off here on the panel with brief opening statements by our speakers, and then open up for questions after about 30 minutes. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A, please use the raise your hand button or post the question in the chat. Although it's, frankly speaking, much nicer to hear your voices and see your faces asking questions, so we highly encourage that. Finally, just a word of thanks to my colleagues in the events and communications teams, and above all to you, our listeners, for joining and for asking crisp and challenging questions at the end. Now, over to you, Francesca. If I could ask you just to kick things off by telling us what you felt when you listened to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, on Tuesday, and her fellow commissioners presenting the economic security strategy. What were your first impressions?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. And well, economic security is part of the portfolio that I've been following for the longest time. So I was actually quite happy to see this. So well, first, we mentioned on the 30th of March in von der Leyen's speech on China, and then being presented on Tuesday. Now, the one problem that I have is it being called a strategy. It's definitely a strategic hat, a strategic framework, something that was indeed missing. But the Commission itself has been calling it for the longest time more of a conversation opener rather than something that's like a full-fledged strategy. And that may explain some of the criticisms. So what was missing is a framework to explain and to give direction to a lot of measures that the European Union and member states have been adopting for the past few years. So in terms of content, a lot is not new. Some things are new, of course, but the great majority is not. What is new is now everything being put together under this sort of unifying hat. If we move on to some of the criticisms that have been popping up, and to a certain extent, I do not share, I think it's a quite balanced conversation opener. And there are issues, of course, but we can talk about this later, is actually quite balanced. But the reason why I think it's quite balanced is because the criticism move on the two ends of the spectrum. On one hand, you have those saying, well, it's not quite clear enough, it's not quite assertive enough. For example, it doesn't even mention China. But I think it does something much more interesting from that perspective, which is to have a risk assessment that, has been in the air for the longest time, since November, and then again discussed during the 30th of March in von der Leyen's speech. And so adopting a scientific methodology, although the devil is in the details, to where are the risks and where should we work more in order to manage those risks, rather than saying, well, it's geopolitical competition, so we need to pay more attention to China specifically or to another actor specifically. The other end of the spectrum is where some member states stay, which is, this is a little bit too much for the European Commission. And the problem there is competence, because economic security sits uncomfortably between the European Commission competence, which is, part of the economic relationship, and member states' competence, which is national security, rather than the content itself, because you have many of these member states that criticize the strategy actually already adopting and implementing measures in a much more broad and, to a certain extent, assertive way than the European Union has been suggesting. So this is sort of my feeling. I feel quite well. If we have to talk about feelings, I feel quite well about this conversation opener, but the job is far from being concluded.
Conversation opener, and you mentioned a number of aspects that we'll come back to, not least the question of whether why China is not mentioned specifically, and to what extent the commissioners did actually allude to it in their remarks. But I wanted to also ask you what this strategy draws on, because as you say, it's not plucked out of thin air. There had been security thinking going on the European level beforehand, and of course on the member states level, in terms of foreign direct investments screening, 5G, etc. So if you could walk us through the kind of ingredients of the strategy.
We don't have enough time to walk through all the ingredients, but one of the cornerstone of what we could define as the economic security turn of the European Union is definitely the adoption and the discussion behind the adoption of the FDI screening mechanism that was, that became operational in a few years ago. But to be honest, that wasn't, although in academic terms, you can see the beginning of the conversation there and the importance of that. And that was my PhD thesis. So I'm quite convinced that was the case. In terms of looking at things through the economic security lens, two events have been particularly important. The first one is the disruption created by the pandemic of COVID-19, because it's the first time in which a heavily reliant on imports bloc, such as the European Union, realizes what it means to have a disruption of the supplies and the imports that it needs. And it's the first time where you hear the Brussels talking about, for example, sovereignty, economic sovereignty, and these sort of things. And then the second part is definitely Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the whole discourse around energy security, energy supply, in which Germany was definitely at the front line of the conversation, in paying, to a certain extent, the price of not having thought or not having implemented measures to diversify from over-relying on one source of supply. So there, the conversation about over-reliance, over-dependence becomes much more prominent and much more important for the European Union. Although, to be honest, I'm a little bit afraid that because we fared both relatively well, and I underscore relatively, the cautionary tale has not been as effective as it should have. One could add, and maybe we'll talk about it later, Lithuania and economic coercion from China to Lithuania. But to be honest, much like in the case of FDI screening, that was much more relevant for the acceleration of the anti-coercion instrument rather than for the broader framework of economic security. Although, of course, economic cohesion and disruptions from economic cohesions are part of the economic security framework. So I would identify these two elements as being the most important ones, rather than the US-China big power competition that is often pointed at when it comes to economic security.
Okay, great, thanks. So let's try to narrow down what we're really talking about here. And Commissioner Vestager already said in her remarks presenting the strategy that we're not talking about economic resilience in a broad sense. We're not talking about pandemic and climate risk so much. We're really talking about economic security in a strategic sense. But the Commission also said that this process isn't done yet, and it will actually need until September, together with the Council, to draw up a list of those critical technologies that we're really talking about. Turning to you, Tim, you've been working on Chinese tech risk for a while, and I'm going to challenge you to not take until September, but just the following 3 minutes to give us at least a glimpse of what those critical technologies are and how the Commission can tackle them.
Thanks, Jan. Well, I think there are several options to reply to your question. One would be to come up with a really broad list of technologies, and then none of the listeners this morning would be surprised to hear quantum, to hear 5G, to hear semiconductors, etc. Another way is to be much more specific and go into different components, but that I think can't be done in 3 minutes, and not even to a conclusive extent. So I'll choose a third option, and that is to elaborate a bit on sort of the 4 risk types that are being identified in the paper so far. Just like Francesca, I think that this is a very good start, a very good conversation opener in general. We can talk about details here and there, and I think some crucial questions are still being really left open at this stage. So what are those 4 risk types that are being identified? Why are they useful? And also, what do we still need to clarify? So the 4 risk types, the first is risk to the resilience of supply chains. And I think that is indeed sort of very good to differentiate from the second type, that is risk to physical and cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. The third being technological security and technology leakage. The fourth being weaponization of economic dependencies and economic coercion. And I think the great advantage of this strategy is that it really differentiates that these 4 types of risks are extremely different and also require very different policy responses. So, for example, the question of technology security and technology leakage, this is really at the heart of the technological competitiveness. So it will require us thinking about industrial policies. It will require us thinking about export controls, about outbound investment screening. Francesca already mentioned that quite a number of, and most of the instruments being mentioned in the paper are already existing. So this is more giving a broader framework, but sort of those instruments could be further developed, and a few ideas for new instruments, just like outbound investment, are in the paper as well and need to be discussed. If you compare that to, say, supply chain security, supply chain resilience, that is more about diversification. So that is something quite different. Questions of cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, this is mostly about trustworthiness of technology or trustworthiness of vendors. So, and all this is standardization, it is certification, it is maybe like-minded sourcing for very critical components. So I think the benefit of such an approach really is to differentiate between different risks and also sort of identify that you really need very different instruments to achieve those very different objectives. Now, where's the problem? And I'll stop then there in a second. I think Francesca already somewhat hinted at that. It's the question, where do the risks start and where do they stop? So I'll just give you one example for the sake of time. So in the field of technology security and technology leakage, is this mostly about the technological competitiveness of Europe in the sense that we need to protect our abilities or is this also about sort of thinking how to keep Chinese capabilities at bay? Is it about sort of reducing Chinese abilities to further develop its technological and economic capacities or not? And I think the paper somewhat hints at a narrow definition, but there's also quite some text in it that could be read as sort of an opener to have a broader understanding of it. And I think that discussion is still out there, and Europe needs to have that discussion and then come to a conclusion and position itself vis-a-vis China, but also in the context of sort of transatlantic alignment or not, or limits of that alignment with the US. So to what extent are we really in congruence with the US, with our American friends, and to what extent do we have a distinct understanding?
Okay, so let's pick one of those elements: outbound investment screening. Politico headlined on Tuesday that the EU wants to, quote, clamp down on companies outsourcing key supply chains. And in the article cited a number of businesses and member states that are very cautious to move quickly in this direction. Do you think they're right? Do they have a point?
Right, in the sense that there are objectives and concerns about it, certainly. I think the outbound investment screening discussion will be very controversial. And the question in the end is that I think there's two questions that you need to answer. The first is for what precisely do we need outbound investment screening? What can we do with outbound investment screening that we can do with export controls? That I think is one end. And that I think is a valid question. I personally still sort of see some room for it. But I think in the second is sort of what precisely are we aiming for here? The paper now, the strategy hints at that this should have a very narrow definition, dual use items. So it should be really focusing on core national security concerns. The alternative still being sort of to have a broader take on this, and that's where I think it would get even more controversial if this is about sort of stopping the ability of China in some of the core cases that could pose, in the long run, actually threats to the technological competitiveness of the European Union.
Okay, great, thanks. Guntram, let's move on to you. You've argued in the piece that I mentioned earlier that it is for the governmental level to identify risks and to steer the process, but really for companies to solve the security problems in the end. Can you explain to us a little bit what you mean by this?
Yes, thanks so much, Jan. And let me just add a few elements to the conversation. I mean, I think the first important element is that this document, this European Commission document, actually goes much further than the German national security strategy in drawing consequences from a new risk assessment. The German national security strategy does use stronger language on China, but it does not draw conclusions in terms of precise policy actions. So I think this is already a very big step forward, and it will be very interesting to see how the European Council will debate this document next week, as apparently the German position is still much more cautious on China than the one expressed in this document. Now, the second point is, and coming more precisely to your question, is that the firms, it is ultimately firms that drive economic exchange, that drive technology exchange, that drive investment exchange. And so the real question is, how strongly should the state and should the European institutions and the national institutions intervene in that exchange, and on what risks? And what this document, this European Commission document does, is it does put quite a significant focus on hard security risks. So it talks about the need to be proportionate and precise in the intervention. Yes, there is a discussion of weaponization of economic dependencies and economic coercion, but by and large, it really focuses on sort of more hardcore security risks. And I think this is, of course, also within the European institutions and even within the broader policy community, there is this big debate how broad or how narrow should be the definition of risks. And I would say that certainly those that are more on the trade side, so the DG trade representatives, have managed to sort of reduce the scope of intervention quite a bit. Now, let me make a third point, which is about who defines security risks. I mean, this is the ultimate and the most difficult part at the European level. In Europe, we do not have competence for security assessment. That is ultimately national. And at the same time, most of the instruments we are talking about are actually instruments that are to a large extent decided at the EU level and involve European institutions one way or another. And so we have this, and we have basically this inconsistency between a single market on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to define a European security dimension. And you know, the way this document tries to solve this is actually taking up an idea that I also put up in my China paper, China de-risking paper that you kindly mentioned, Jan, is to form some sort of a committee where national security expertise meets and pools the expertise and comes to some sort of a European assessment when it comes in particular to the issue of outbound investment. So on the whole, I think this document is actually a big step forward. I'm very positive on it, and well, the work lies ahead. A big work lies ahead, obviously.
Let's try to flesh this last point out a little more. The process of identifying risks and the European level committee. One of the things that the Commission talks about and promised to have is what they call a structured dialogue with the private sector. How do you envision this could look like? And isn't there a risk for too much power in corporate hands and decisions in the end?
Well, I mean, you do need the structured dialogue with the private sector because the private sector really knows what is a cutting edge technology. The private sector has much superior information about dual use possibilities than most governments would have, just because they are at the frontier of technological progress. Governments are not. So you need that structured dialogue. However, I think you are absolutely right. You cannot have an uninformed structured dialogue where one side has all the knowledge and the government side basically just takes on board what businesses tell it, because then there is multiple risks for government capture. So this dialogue has to be, you know, as it says, it has to be well structured so that no side can excessively benefit from it, and that, you know, protectionism or the defense of specific corporate interests doesn't get a big headway. So I think this is going to be quite a challenge. But again, let me reiterate. I think the key problem at the European level is that we don't really have a very good institution to assess the security risks, and the national institutions, they are basically focused on very specific national risks, but the risks go cross-border, and so we really have a security definition problem here in Europe, and that's why I think it's really important that we go the step forward and trying to form some sort of a committee where intelligence and security information gets pooled.
Well, perhaps there's also some space on that committee for experts like yourselves, the think tank community, academics, to include more expertise from that spectrum as well. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about before we move to the Q&A in just a few minutes is that this strategy didn't appear out of nowhere. It appeared in the context of a number of other meetings and strategies being presented, and especially the German-Chinese government talks here in Berlin over the last days. Now, also with a view to the long-promised China strategy of the German government, I wanted to ask you, Guntram, where you think this really can be contextualized. What would you expect of the following months, especially from the German perspective and from the perspective of the German government, to really make the most of this first opener?
Well, you see, the German government in Germany faces a big dilemma, right? I mean, the big dilemma is that China is a big market. Our big companies make a lot of money and profits still in that market. At the same time, I think we all know that China goes politically in a difficult direction for us, and that it increasingly penalizes and leverages on firms, on activities in China, to extract economic and political advantage, and so we have to find this sweet spot, this balancing act, where we defend our core interests while at the same time core security interests in particular, while at the same time not giving up on the economic benefits. And in my view, at the end of the day, we need to be very clear-eyed on hard security risks, and these are difficult to define. But if we define them, let's be really strong on those. So critical infrastructure, dual-use technology. I mean, these are issues where I think we have to be very clear and tough. But on the broader economic exchange, I mean, let's continue that, but let's make it in a way that if things go bad in a high-stake confrontation, we can actually get out of it without completely collapsing, right? I mean, so this is then the job of firms, and the government needs to tell firms that they have to prepare for this day T, as we say, so the day when there's a military confrontation around Taiwan or similar, in a sense that the viability of the core businesses and the core supply chains remains intact. And so the government really struggles to find that sweet spot. And to my mind, the Scholz government has been a little too kind to the Chinese now when they visited Berlin and then Munich. I mean, this didn't smell like de-risking at all. It smelled more like falling in love with each other. And I think that's not the right message at this moment.
From the vantage point of Brussels, Francesca, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what the reaction has been in other countries other than Germany, especially those who might have interests in having closer relationships with China. Is there anything like a common response, or do you see fractions across Europe?
I see quite a few frictions, to be honest. I think the momentum that was built from 2020, 2021, even more with the sanction and everything, and then the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China not condemning the invasion, is sort of losing its strength, with China opening up and trying to attract investments and companies, of course, with many caveats, economic and diplomatic and political. But you see the Central and Eastern European member states that are increasingly assertive and positioned in this assertive corner vis-a-vis China. And then you see larger countries like Germany and France that also are sending contradicting signals. So it's also difficult to figure it out. I think the main problem is really coordination and Europeanization. It's not new, so I know that I'm repeating something that has been said for the longest time. But the problem is, again, in theory, the German government had committed to a certain extent to Europeanize the process of the relationship with China and the exchanges. But then in this instance, there was no European high-level representation at the meeting. So it was literally still, again, bilateral. And Germany is not the only one. I'm just saying, you know, because we're talking about Berlin, then Berlin is the example that I have. The problem is that China knows how to play this game very well. It knows that if it reaches out to single member states, it has so much more leverage than if it does when you have more member states together. And right now, I'm really afraid that quite a few member states are forgetting that China is still the China that, you know, was 2 years ago in the sense of the strategic objectives are still the same. And just because narratively it has changed this approach, it doesn't mean that it has changed. So quite a few divisions within the European Union and not enough Europeanization of the relationship with China. Again, nothing new, but it's just to repeat these points.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let me pick up one of the questions in the chat and encourage you to ask more and raise your hands. The question being, or the point really, the comment being raised by David Fouquet about the more is done, the greater the reaction. Or in other words, what are the risks of a Chinese backlash in terms of economic protectionism? Tim, perhaps you would like to say a few words on this.
Always good having questions from David. So thanks for that. I'm slightly more optimistic than David might be on that one. Primarily because if you look at China's reactions to the October export controls from the United States, they are, if you like, surprisingly few. And I think it has two reasons. First, it may hint at the fact that the Chinese realize that they actually need a continued cooperation more than one might assume. And I think that also goes for Europe. I mean, at this point, Francesca is right. It may just be a narrative shift, but the fact that we do see a charm offensive coming our way as Europeans is related to the fact that the Chinese see that there's that they would want to have some continuation of cooperation, that there is less of options there in that regard with the US, and that indeed sort of somewhat breaking away the Europeans is useful. Of course, there may be sort of red lines. If we cross them, that may change, but I'm more optimistic on that front. A second element, I also think that the Chinese want to distinguish themselves from the Americans, frankly. So the Americans adopting very much an approach that is very proactive, very actively using export controls, investment screening mechanisms. We will see outbound investment screening coming to the US earlier than it will arrive here in Europe. Once more, I mean, I still think that we will adopt something as well, but the Americans are more proactive. And I think one of the messages China wants to send around the globe that may be targeted to some extent at us, but certainly at some of the emerging and developing economies in the global south is that they have a different style and different model of doing international politics. So to some extent, so I can never exclude a backlash, but I think there's also incentives of the Chinese to actually keep their responses sort of in somewhat check. But of course, there will be red lines. So if we adopted sort of a full-blown US approach of saying somewhat of a containment strategy, then of course there would be a Chinese reaction. But I'm somewhat more optimistic that there are incentives for the Chinese to limit their response.
Thank you. This perhaps links to the question that Nikolai von Schepp posted in the chat about the challenges of a China-first policy. Herr von Schepp, would you like to put your question in person to the panel?
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting briefing. I think in a variety of fields of new technology, you have in China a China-first policy with less foreign or Western investment possible. And my question is, isn't this a real risk for European companies at this moment? Thank you.
Guntram, you look like you would like to respond. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think what is interesting in this current competition is that in the documents, we always write about preserving the technological edge, right? And obviously, Europe and European companies do have technological edges in some areas, but increasingly in other areas, China by now has the technological edge. And I mean, we all know the examples. I mean, batteries, battery production is more advanced in China. We have in the field of digital technologies, we have certainly areas where China is actually leading. And increasingly, companies will tell you, well, we are in China not just because of the size of the market. We are actually there because of the technology. And so to my mind, this is what makes it quite a unique situation compared to all the previous sort of races for technologies. I mean, when we had the race between the Soviet Union and the US, I mean, it was clear that the US and the West was well advanced of the Soviet Union. And so any policy trying to limit and slow down the spread of technology really was a one-sided one, because the Soviet Union was trying to get the technology from us and not the other way around. Now, increasingly, we have sectors where it actually goes in both directions, and that makes this game much more difficult to understand and grasp.
Thanks, Guntram. Claudia, I know that you have been to Brussels recently, and you probably also know about some of the differences among the Commission. So I'm very interested and curious to hear your question.
Oh, okay. I thought I could just pose a question. Okay,
Of course you can.
First of all, I'm very sorry I'm late. So if I have a question that you addressed already, you can just basically ignore it. So the first point that I have is what Francesca said, the European position, and that we still very much have these national approaches to China. And we will have the upcoming EU-China summit next week. So what do you expect to happen during that summit? That's my first question. And the second one is on outbound investment screening. That's something that the Americans are discussing for a long time. Europe has started. It's in the beginning of the discussion. Is that something that you see as inevitable to happen? Is that something that you consider that we need and that is inevitable? Because I have the feeling that the Commission President very much focuses on these issues. And so the question, will that happen now, or is there still an option that we might reconsider? And maybe a third question, because you mentioned that I was in Brussels, I still see differences between DG Trade and the Commission President. Francesca was there as well. So there was still a lot of focus on the openness coming from DG Trade, or a very narrow definition of what is national security. It was also about the GATT exception versus a very broad definition. And I think maybe Francesca, if you could say something on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Solari, just
please pick any of the flowers of this bouquet of questions.
Okay. First of all, I hope that the reference to I'm not aware there's a EU-China summit next week. I know there's the council. Okay, perfect. No, for a moment, I was afraid I had missed a major piece of information that I should be aware of. Okay, so on the council, there's I have a feeling that the communication at the end of the council is going to be quite, to put in American terms, vanilla. It's going to be a lot about re-engaging. We mentioned the usual problems in South China Sea, unilateral change of the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, Hong Kong, so on and so forth, Xinjiang, and so on and so forth. But I would not expect anything groundbreaking, and I would not even expect the level of assertiveness that was in von der Leyen's speech on the 13th of March. What I would expect would be some references to the speech, but I'm not even entirely confident that is going to be the case. On outbound investments, so I have a problem with outbound investment screening, and Tim has mentioned them already, which is, what are we trying to do with this? In the sense of, the Americans want to screen also portfolio investments, not just foreign direct investments. And they have a reason for that. Pension funds have investments in China that could be problematic, so they want to do that. But in terms of the European Union, we have much less deep and hot capital in China, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense to screen portfolio investments, and then you would screen direct investments. But larger direct investments, as shown by a report made by Rodium, I don't remember if this year or last year, are not necessarily in security-related sectors. So that becomes a little bit complicated. So do you want to screen smaller investments? And if you want to screen smaller investments, how do you get the data, considering that the large majority of our member states doesn't do any screening of outbound investments? So you would have to set up something new, which is different from what happened back with the FDI, with the inbound investment screening, where you had a few member states who were already doing something different from what perhaps was proposed and from how it has developed, but it was there. So that is why the idea also of having an exchange of information and a group of experts is because we lack the data, to be honest, to make a decision on how the outbound investment screening will look like. Now, as you rightfully pointed out, Claudia, the presidency is quite decided that this is happening. And I think the reasoning behind that is fair. And it's not as much that, we need this very much, but from the experience of the export controls of October 7th, they know that if we don't have something, and if we don't set our own European boundaries to that something, eventually the United States is going to come and handpick the member states that it needs to convince to adopt some sort of outbound investment. So it's much cleverer to have at least a benchmark, a European benchmark, to show the Americans before they come and select the Netherlands or Germany or others and implement something. Now, we could debate whether this is the right approach or not. And the last question, internal divisions. Yes, I mean, I'm not saying anything new or anything surprising. There are tensions, especially related to how the process of the economic security strategy went about. I'm sure we all realized how quickly it went, and that is because there was a lot of drive coming from the higher ups, which was difficult to digest, not just within DG Trade, but in general in the European processes. And I'll stop here. Apologies.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a question from Lucas Unterberg about the lack of European cloud and digital technologies and AI, saying that the European companies that are relevant in this regard are SAP and ASML, and they are much smaller than the US and the Chinese giants. Isn't there a risk, he asks, that the EU at some point simply has no choice but to adopt one external technological provider simply because there are no viable European alternatives? And does this not run counter to any economic security strategy? Tim, I feel this one's for you, maybe.
I don't know. I mean, this is not new, but the economic security strategy shouldn't be about, that shouldn't be a decoupling strategy and sort of say we need to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. So do we have to pick sides? Well, that is one option, but I think, and we may be forced to that. I think no one in Europe really maybe not no one, but I don't think that's sort of the general course that the vast majority of European leaders would like to see. We may be forced into a situation where we have to pick sides, and then I think we know whom we would pick. Because if anything, we have learned in the last 14 months how important the security guarantees of the US are ultimately for Europe. But I think what Europe tries to get at here is understanding that it needs to sort of position itself in a continuously interdependent world and de-risk in that context from continued interdependence. And I think that is sort of quite the way to go. So reduce the risks of continued interdependence. I think I'd like to make sort of two quick points in that regard. One is, I think what is largely still overlooked, it somewhat hints in this strategy as it speaks about European competitiveness. But I think what is really crucial, and I think that is something we need to focus on, is that we remain strategically indispensable for China and others. So if we live in a world where we won't be able to decouple, and then the question is, so if a price remains always, if things go wrong for us, then we'll need to try and keep the price up for others to go against our interests. So I think that's somewhat missing still from the discussion. There's not enough thought about that. The second thing is, we may agree that we should focus on national security, and the question is how to define it. But sort of when it comes to, I think that Guntram, in his earlier remarks, I think captured very well sort of the dilemma that we are in whenever we talk about the issues in the strategy that go beyond national security. And that is, on the one hand, he said, well, we should continue the broader trade and broader economic exchange with China. And then he said, but we need to be prepared for the day X, where maybe we would face a new situation. And then the question is, will Europe arrive at the point where it says, well, in preparation for these new conditions that we hope that never get on us, we will have to reduce sort of China's general footprint in our supply chains, and potentially not just in our supply chains, but in global supply chains. And that, I think, sort of hints very much sort of at the problem where we need to find the sweet spot. To what extent do we continue sort of with the current economic exchange with China that we say is not directly security relevant? And to what extent do we prepare for sort of the worst case and sort of say, well, we need to already foresee that and reduce China's general footprint because prices are high. And I think it's probably, and I think Guntram and I agree, it should neither be of the two extremes, but I think that is sort of the crucial discussion to have, sort of where on this continuum between these two extremes are we actually then in the end falling. And I think that is really difficult. And for that, I think it's good that we have a discussion opener with that document, because I think I would have also been concerned if the Commission thought it can solve that really difficult dilemma within, how much was it now, 8 weeks or so. I think it just takes more time.
Guntram, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think on this point, I think Tim, you put it very well. I mean, I think of this really in terms of sort of two baskets. I mean, one is where there's a sort of clear military dual use, high security stakes, critical infrastructure, etc. So this is one basket, and it's extremely difficult already, this basket, because as we know, it's not always that clear cut what is security and what is not security. But I mean, conceptually, at least that's clear. And then there is the sort of the much more difficult part, which is all the other economic exchanges where economic coercion can happen, where dependencies are, where macroeconomic risks arise, where firm-specific risks arise, political economy risks arise, and how do we deal with this, right? And that's what Tim described at the end. And you know, when you look at sort of the macro numbers, yeah, I mean, the issue isn't actually so big, right? I mean, so if you get these trade models and you simulate a decoupling between Europe and China, where bilateral trade goes down by more than 90%, yeah, which would be, I mean, basically complete decoupling, 90%. You know, the macro effects are actually manageable. We are talking here of orders of magnitude of 1 or 2% of GDP. Yeah, I mean, so less than a banking crisis, much less than a COVID crisis, more than Brexit, obviously much more than Brexit, but much less than these big shocks. Now, what these models, however, cannot capture very well is sort of dependencies on very specific items that are crucial in the entire value chain. And that's where sort of chips come in, for example. I mean, so high-end chips from Taiwan that are only produced in Taiwan, if they would not be available anymore on the global market, how big would be the repercussions? How quickly could we do the adjustment? That the models don't capture well. And that's why in my policy brief with all on China de-risking, I'm basically saying we have to do an empirical approach here, right? I mean, so we have to look at the actual numbers. We have to look at goods by goods. You know, someone told me the statistics that Europe is importing more than 10,000 different goods, of which only 260 are procured only from one country. All the others are procured from several countries. So this is already some sort of a metric, right? I mean, so let's make sure that those where we procure only from China, where this is only a full dependency or an 80% dependency or 70% dependency, there we have to act, and we have to sort of incentivize companies to find new trade routes. And that's, I mean, that's why it's so important to have a trade agreement with Mercosur, and it's frankly incomprehensible that we cannot move forward on this Mercosur. I mean, we need to incentivize alternatives, but there may be instances where we have to actually regulate excessive dependencies and actually tell companies, well, this is too much, you have to go down. And that needs to be very empirically driven, right? I mean, it cannot be sort of random just because there was a news report on something somewhere. No, it needs to be really thoroughly thought through, because otherwise, you will just sort of pick some selective issues and not really capture the crucial dependencies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think your last point is very interesting, because it invites us to zoom out for a moment and think about what the Commission might mean when they're talking about this strategy being not country specific, it being country agnostic, and of course that's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, and indeed the commissioners did mention China and Russia in their remarks, but I still want to ask the question to you, to the panelists. What are some of the other countries that we might have in the back of our minds, and that a strategy like this might apply to in the future? Because at least on paper, it's designed like one. Or is this an entirely irrelevant point, and it should really be relabeled into an EU-China economic security strategy? Tim, you look like you're reaching out to unmute yourself.
Well, if you ask me to, I don't know. I mean, I'm a China specialist, so I'm probably not well positioned to sort of say, and Francesca nodding as well, I think we're both not the ones who would know about a critical dependency from a third country. You may find some. I think Guntram, I think, has hinted that as well earlier. It is ultimate. I mean, if you name those countries or not, this is about mostly China, maybe to some extent also Russia. Is it necessary to name it in the document? I don't think so. You can design something actor agnostic. So I don't criticize them not mentioning China once in the communication. I don't think it's necessary. So I think it's good to have sort of an approach that is actor agnostic. You could still always check whether it's relevant for others. That it is developed very much from our thinking about China. It's a matter of fact. I think we're hardly able to question that. To me, that's totally fine. So I don't see any need to go into that. But again, whether there is one specific good that we source from one other country and that's problematic, I don't know. That's outside of my expertise.
Probably more so when we're talking about energy dependencies than critical goods and specific technologies. But I want to bring in my colleague Milan with a question.
Thank you. Good morning. Within the time left, I want to ask about your reactions to the big event in Berlin earlier this week, the German-Chinese government consultations. How it was handled, the timing of it, a few days after Tony Blinken, US foreign minister's visit to Beijing. And also a related question to how China is handling us as the EU. Through which countries, how they are sort of trying to shape the outcomes of what is clear, a more, stricter, careful EU approach towards
that. Would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, as I already said, I don't think the EU and Germany managed this visit terribly well. I mean, we, I think, gave quite a big platform to the Chinese government. I think it was a mistake to have a press conference without the press asking questions. I mean, that's a simple, small thing, but it is really not the right signal, right? And, I think in terms of the relation to the Blinken trip, I mean, I don't think that was sort of planned jointly. I mean, that was sort of, these things are more coincidental on timing, and the fact that Joe Biden then one day after Blinken comes to some sort of a positive mood with China, calls Xi Jinping a dictator, I think was also not properly planned, but rather sort of, these are the randomness in political life, I guess, that happened. But I think what I would comment, Milan, is that China, of course, very skillfully does this, right? I mean, it goes to Berlin because Germany is the biggest trading partner and the biggest investor and in Europe, and therefore has a lot of leverage. And I think when you read the national security strategy, that was my opening point, you see that there is tougher language, but there's no strategic consequences drawn from it on China, right? So it shows that they really feel that they have some leverage and some scope here in Berlin and in Munich, I guess, and then they go to Paris, right? And all of this right in the few days before we have a European Council discussion on China policy. And I think all of this is testimony to the, I would say, very large diplomatic and strategic skills of China. And I think China, perhaps the last point here, it's clear for China that the EU is indispensable, and the Russian war against Ukraine has been a big nuisance to China. And so this is an attempt to sort of change a bit the narrative on China. But the issue is that Europe is also indispensable to the US, right? And so this is what makes it interesting. It is clear that the US cannot withstand a major military confrontation with China if it were to happen without Europe 100% on its side. Because, I mean, even in terms of military weapon production, the US capacities wouldn't be sufficient. So the US needs the EU very clearly. And China does understand that, Europe is the linchpin, and it is doing the charm offensive, of course, and is trying to convince Germany first, because Germany is such an important country. And geopolitically, I would have wished us to send clearer messages, not saying we don't want to do trade, but clearer messages on security, on basic principles such as press freedom, etc.
Mm-hmm. A very brief comment, Tim, since we're running out of time.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear 20 seconds from Francesca on the broader European picture. So I'll just want to say two very quick things. One is, if you look at the coalition agreement in Germany, then the coalition promised that it will Europeanize the government consultations. That did not happen. I will not publicly speculate who was responsible for that, but a hint, maybe you won't be surprised who it was if you follow the discussion. So that I think was really unfortunate. That I think is sort of bridging Germany and Europe. I think that is really problematic. I'll skip the second point because maybe Francesca wants to say something on.
Francesca, for closing remark.
Yes, just very quickly. I think one thing that we always underestimate is communication. I don't think that the Chinese are particularly strategic. They've been doing the same thing for years. For some reason, we haven't learned how to respond. The meeting itself is the objective. And as soon as we guarantee that meeting, you have the communication point. And to be honest, yes, they came first to Germany, but we should never forget about the trip from Macron to Beijing and how it was, planned and prepared. It was all to flatter Macron and the French as well. So on one hand, maybe the Chinese are good, but we're really bad at adopting a strategic communication strategy. Like we're really, really bad. So that is the first thing that we need to improve, and coordinating messages and being sure that we do not fall in the same traps that we've fallen in the past. And I'll conclude with just this last comment. which is about why the economic security strategy needs to be country agnostic, is because, and Tim hinted at this, it needs to be future-proof. So today, China is the main issue, but we don't know, for example, how the United States after the 2024 elections is going to look like. The anti-coercion instrument was originally thought on the basis of American economic coercion, not Chinese economic coercion, and then it developed into becoming something more Chinese-focused. So not knowing what the future is hiding for the European Union means that country agnostic is the way forward. And I'll just conclude here.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Well, it seems like there are a lot of question marks for the upcoming weeks and months on what happens in the Council, what happens until September in the Commission, what will be in the German-China strategy. And fortunately for you listeners, we here at DGAP will keep an eye on all those developments and come back to them in future iterations of this morning briefing. For now, I'd just like to thank all of our panelists and our support team in the background, and to you, our listeners, for tuning in, for asking great questions. And we will meet for at least a few more weeks until we go in the summer recess. So stay tuned and see you next week. Thanks a lot and have a good day. Bye-bye.